The widow sat in her modest apartment in 1976, her hands trembling as she spoke to the interviewer. Lina Heydrich was 76 years old now, but her eyes still flashed with the same defiance they'd held 34 years earlier when American soldiers came to arrest her. "My husband," she said slowly, "was a great man destroyed by jealous inferiors." The reporter shifted uncomfortably. This woman's husband had been Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Holocaust, the man so ruthless that even Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. But what happened to his family after his death? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine. When Reinhard Heydrich died on June 4, 1942, from wounds inflicted by Czech resistance fighters in Prague, he left behind his wife Lina and 4 young children. Klaus was 11, Heydrich was 9, Silke was 7, and little Marte was just 18 months old. There would be no 5th child. Lina had been pregnant when her husband died, but she miscarried, perhaps from the shock and stress of his assassination. The Heydrich family didn't suffer immediately. Far from it. Hitler himself attended Reinhard's elaborate state funeral in Berlin, and the Führer made certain promises to the grieving widow. Lina and her children were allowed to remain in their luxurious home on the Jungfernbrechen estate outside Prague, a property the Nazis had confiscated from a Jewish family. For nearly 3 more years, while millions died in camps her husband had helped design, Lina Heydrich lived in comfort with her children, supported by the Nazi state. But in May 1945, everything changed. The Third Reich collapsed. Soviet and American forces swept across Europe, and Lina Heydrich suddenly found herself on the wrong side of history. The Czech resistance hadn't forgotten who had lived in that estate. On May 8th, just as the war in Europe ended, Czech partisans arrived at the Heydrich home. They gave Lina and her children 30 minutes to pack whatever they could carry. 30 minutes to abandon the life they'd known. Young Heydrich, now 12 years old, later recalled the terror of that day. The shouting men with guns, his mother's pale face, as she frantically gathered photographs and documents. The family was transported first to a detention center, then to a series of American internment camps in Germany. Lina Heydrich was classified as a major offender under the denazification laws. After all, she hadn't just been the wife of a monster. She'd been a convinced Nazi herself, a member of the party since before she even met Reinhard. She'd been there in the beginning, attending rallies, believing in the cause. For 2 years, Lina and her children lived in these camps, sharing space with other Nazi families whose worlds had been destroyed. They had barely enough food. The children wore threadbare clothes. Klaus, the eldest boy, now a teenager, struggled to understand how his family had fallen so far. His father had been one of the most powerful men in Europe. Now they were prisoners, despised by everyone. Then, in 1947, something happened that would haunt the family forever. 14-year-old Klaus was riding his bicycle near the camp when he was struck by a vehicle. He died from his injuries. Some accounts say it was a British military truck. Others suggest it might have been deliberate revenge against Heydrich's son. The truth was never fully established. Lina was devastated. She'd already lost her husband. Now she'd lost her firstborn son. After her release from detention in 1948, Lina faced a world that wanted nothing to do with her. She had no money, no home, no prospects. The German government initially denied her any widow's pension because Reinhard had been declared a war criminal. She struggled to feed her 3 surviving children. For a while, they lived in a single room in a boarding house. But Lina Heydrich was not the type to accept defeat quietly. She was, by all accounts, as stubborn and ideologically committed as her husband had been ruthless. Throughout the 1950s, she filed lawsuit after lawsuit against the German government, demanding her rights as a war widow. She argued that her husband had been a soldier serving his country and that his family deserved the same benefits as any other military family. Astonishingly, she won. In 1956, a German court ruled that Lina was entitled to a pension based on Reinhard's SS rank. The decision caused outrage among Holocaust survivors and Jewish organizations. Here was the widow of one of the Holocaust's chief architects, receiving government money while millions of victims' families had received nothing. But the law was the law, and Lina collected that pension for the rest of her life. She used some of that money to open a small guest house on the island of Fehmarn in northern Germany. It became something of an unofficial meeting place for unreconstructed Nazis. Former SS officers would come to visit, to reminisce about the old days, to speak with the widow of the man they still considered a hero. Lina never apologized, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged that her husband had done anything wrong. Her surviving children had to live with their father's legacy in different ways. Heydrich, the second son, tried to distance himself somewhat from the past. He changed the spelling of his name, became an aerospace engineer, and rarely spoke publicly about his father. But he never completely rejected the Heydrich name. When he died in 2007, some controversy arose when it was revealed he'd named his own son Reinhard, after his infamous grandfather. Silke, the daughter, married and took her husband's name, stepping further away from the shadow of her father. She lived a quiet life and avoided the press. The youngest, Marte, born just months before her father's death, had no memories of him at all. She too married and tried to live anonymously, but Lina never let them forget. She kept the memory of Reinhard Heydrich alive in their home, speaking of him as a hero, a misunderstood genius destroyed by his enemies. She wrote a memoir, published in 1976, called Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. The title might sound like a confession, but the book was actually a defense of her husband, portraying him as a dedicated patriot rather than the murderous architect of genocide. In interviews during her later years, Lina remained defiant. When asked about the Holocaust, about the millions murdered under policies her husband had championed at the WWII conference, she would deflect or deny. She claimed the Holocaust had been exaggerated. She insisted Reinhard had only been following orders. She portrayed him as a loving father and devoted husband, conveniently ignoring his numerous affairs and his central role in implementing the final solution. The German public was appalled but also morbidly fascinated. Here was a living link to the Nazi high command, a woman who had shared a bed with one of history's greatest monsters and who still defended him decades later. Journalists would seek her out, partly from genuine historical interest, partly for the sensationalism of interviewing someone so unrepentant. Lina Heydrich died on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74. She never apologized. She never expressed regret. To her dying day, she insisted that her husband had been a great man wronged by history. She's buried in an unmarked grave, the location kept secret to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. The Heydrich children, who survived into adulthood, faced a terrible burden. How do you live a normal life when your father designed the machinery of genocide, when his signature appears on documents ordering the murder of millions? Some descendants of Nazi leaders have spent their lives atoning, speaking out against hatred, working to ensure the Holocaust is never forgotten. But the Heydrich children, raised by Lina's unrepentant hand, largely chose silence instead. Today, there are Heydrich grandchildren and great-grandchildren living quietly in Germany. Most want nothing to do with their ancestors' legacy. They've changed their names, moved away, tried to build lives untouched by the horrors of the past. But that name, that terrible name, follows them like a curse. The story of Reinhard Heydrich's family reveals an uncomfortable truth about the aftermath of the Nazi regime. While millions of perpetrators face trial and punishment, their families often slipped through the cracks of justice. Lina Heydrich lived comfortably for 43 years after her husband's death, subsidized by the same German state he had tried to transform into an instrument of racial murder. She raised her children to believe in his innocence, or at least his righteousness, poisoning another generation with the ideology that had already poisoned millions. It's a reminder that the consequences of evil don't end with the evildoer's death. They ripple outward through time, touching children and grandchildren, warping lives and perpetuating hatred. Lina Heydrich could have chosen a different path. She could have acknowledged her husband's crimes, sought forgiveness, raised her children to understand and condemn what their father had done. Instead, she chose defiance, denial, and the perpetuation of a monstrous legacy. The Czech resistance fighters who killed Reinhard Heydrich in 1942 eliminated one of the most dangerous men in Nazi Germany. But they couldn't eliminate his legacy. That lived on in his widow's unrepentant words, in his children's conflicted silence, and in the difficult questions we still grapple with today about guilt, inheritance, and how we deal with the families of those who commit unspeakable crimes.